I'm a person I'm still hosting my stack on-prem. And I like the flexibility of using the cloud. But I'm afraid of the cost that could occur with it. Should I be afraid?
What's your stack? Tell me something about your application.
Let's say that I have SQL servers, I have on-prem everything.
There's a big shift when you go to something that has elasticity, and that is that the bill can also be elastic. When you're buying something that's fixed and you're purchasing, a couple of things get combined together. And I'm going to get a little philosophical, and I think kind of at this like philosophical level, I read like economics, PhDs and stuff. It's a purchase decision that's happening at the same time as sort of a usage and an architecture decision. And anytime there's a change, it's all happening at once. And there's kind of a moment to stop and reflect and say, hey, do we want to scale? Let's ask the pros and cons. That's great for something like control and predictability. What it's not great for is something like rapid scalability. And so going over to the cloud gives you less latency on scaling, less latency on adopting new features. There's not this explicit decision. But that explicit decision that took a lot of time was actually a benefit when it came to cost. It gave you a moment to pause and say, do we want to spend more money? What are the pros and cons of this thing? If you're on-prem and you want to upgrade your stack, that's a big journey. If you're on the cloud, you can often do it faster, especially if you've architected your services where you can plug and play like a new thing, a new model comes out and you say, yeah, let's switch over. Some of that elasticity also comes with cost elasticity, which is a bit problematic unless you put things in place. And what we often talk about is sort of visibility and then taking action and stopping things, and where that balance is between I want to see when something happens, I want to know when something happens, and I want something to actually happen on its own, and where we want to be in that journey. And so in the cloud space, one of the things I always think about is like, what is the worst case scenario and how bad it is? Back when I worked at Google in our onboarding process, there was like a thing like one of the worst things you can do is make a decision on behalf of Google that puts us on the cover of the Wall Street Journal for the bad reasons, right? Like that means you failed that day. Like I put that same lens on us, like what are we doing and what is the failure mode if this goes slightly wrong, and how likely is it to be wrong? One of the worst things you can do as a cloud provider or infrastructure provider is to lose a customer's data or let it get into the wrong hands. Like that's full stop. Like you've really messed up. You've lost trust. You've lost their customers' trust. Worst thing you can do. Sort of second worst thing you can do is stop their applications from being able to run. Like they're locked. They can't do their work. They can't run a query. Their pipeline is blocked. Their app went down because of you. And I think we all experience this in the cloud. When I go to watch Netflix and I can't watch Netflix because an AWS region is down, AWS, some account rep is apologizing to Netflix in that case. I think of the same thing from a cost perspective. Now, the cost often doesn't affect like, hey, is a customer's data going to reach? And so I can sleep a little easier than I do some of my security peers. But if you put controls on cost, that often means you're going to stop something. And if you stop something, you stop a workload. And, it depends what that workload is. If that workload is someone doing analysis for a white paper they're writing that they have a month to work on, that's fine. They have some latency. They can come and add some more budget and work on the thing. And maybe they won't miss their deadline. If that application is real-time training a model that makes life or death decisions, you've done something very bad here. You might have cost a life. And, I think we saw recently a really bad example of applications and businesses being stopped because of technology. A security provider had a bug. Bugs happen, but this bug was deployed real quickly and people got stranded and, millions of dollars of lawsuits are happening. And what I never want to do is wake up to, like the news saying all these companies are blocked because Greg's team made a decision to stop a thing that stopped all their workloads or went a little wrong. It's not unrealistic either. There's a story in the news recently about a cloud provider that sort of deleted the whole account of an Australian company, I believe, like an investment firm. And it had something to do with their account and their subscription. And I saw that and had shudders. And I was just like, yeah, that is the worst case. You never want that to happen. And so I'm always thinking about what is the balance? What is the margin for error? And stopping a customer's work is very risky. So I tend to err away from it. Spending a little too much money, that's number 3 on the list. That's bad. But there's ways you can remedy it. Like worst case, I can give you a refund. And so we always think about, if you're erring on the side of where do you want to fall? Do you want to fall towards accidentally shutting off a workload that hadn't been shut off because someone made an honest mistake? A developer, picked a cluster that had a budget shut off and didn't realize that had a budget shut off and they put a production load on it? Or do you want to err on the side of maybe charging them a little bit more and we can figure out how to remedy it after the fact? I would always lean towards that safer one. But you have to make sure in the fullness of time, you're not leaning too far that way too often, or you end up, going over people's budgets and causing some other problems.
And I think you pretty much jump into the next question that I was going to ask, which is, as a vendor, how do you balance cost management with maintaining or enhancing customer satisfaction and service quality? But you pretty much answer that there. So
yeah, and I'd say it is easier at some companies than other. I haven't worked at every vendor in the world, but I've talked to people and hired people from various companies, and I know a decent bit about cultures and what the incentives are. And one of the reasons I came to Databricks is I think we're in the place where it's easier to have the right incentives. One of our core values of a company is customers first, and we really think about how are we creating happy customers and delivering value to them. Because of the fact that our leadership is still the co-founders, and our co-founders are very technical people. They're all engineering PhDs. I think we're in a place where we're going to be more likely to serve developers, which I think is a better place to be in. You see some companies as they get bigger, their incentives shift towards serving their own shareholders and hitting their revenue goals. And sometimes that sacrifices the customers and they make some trade-offs. Even within that, what you realize is a customer isn't a person. A customer is an entity with many people. And their incentives are mixed within it. The developer at that company wants to develop good software and help the company. But the CFO at that company might want to stop spending and keep it under budget because they have their own P&L to worry about. And what I've seen is some enterprise software companies ship features to win a deal that give too much power to the CFO role. And then they end up with a bad user experience for the developer. And then they've sort of blocked the ability of work to happen. And they call this the principal agent problem, where the person making the decision doesn't have the same incentives as the person using it. And I'd say Databricks leans towards the data worker, towards the engineer. And I think that's awesome because too few companies do that. But what that means sometimes is not giving that switch to the CFO to shut things off when it's at $400. But then sometimes the developer says, oh, I wish there was that shut off. It's a double-edged sword though, and so I think it's always tricky to balance. And I'd say Databricks right now tends to be on the side of the data worker a little more. And I personally really like that because I've seen too many companies err the other way, and it ends up resulting in worse things for everyone in the long run.
Which starts a little bit in contrast with my view, which I shifted a little bit more towards that CFO, because from the perspective of someone gets a very, very nasty bill, even if it eventually ends up getting fixed, it's still a very nasty experience. And I see that hey, we just got this very nasty bill, and what other options do we have than this cloud provider? So
yeah, absolutely. And I think there's sort of an order of magnitude thing to it as well. Very nasty bill, that's a very large amount. There's some very bad things that can happen with it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about cost. And one of the things I think about is, there's enterprise companies that a bill of $5,000, someone might be upset, but no one's going to lose their job or lose sleep over it. That enterprise can afford that money. $5,000 to a college student that's trying to learn this thing and sign up on a platform is a lot. And I've seen threads on Hacker News and Reddit of oh my gosh, I got a $5,000 cloud bill. That's more money than I have at all? Like, what am I going to do? Making sure that that person doesn't end up in that situation, or that there's remediation and there's not that period of stress, I think is super important. And then as the numbers go up, it starts to feel the same way for the enterprise. It might not be $5,000 for the enterprise, but $500,000, $5 million. Yeah, it feels that way eventually. Avoiding those mistakes that are that big a magnitude, I think, is super important. As you follow kind of that spectrum to sort of the smaller things, if you put so much control that people can't spend a penny without approval, you end up in a place where people can't get any work done because there's so much sort of red tape in doing things. And it's kind of having to decide where you want to fall in the spectrum. You mentioned you're leaning closer towards that CFO, avoiding large bills. Maybe it's you're going up in responsibility in your career. You're now responsible for a larger thing. And I think we're always trying to find that balance. Where is the right place for us to be as a company, with our customers, with where they are in maturity, with the portfolio of products we have, which is changing and growing. Now there's a lot of things that run on GPUs, which are a lot more expensive. So it's sort of changing how much you could spend, how quickly. And I do think we're trying to find that right balance and are adjusting. And that's sort of the sweet spot my team lives in, is trying to figure out, okay, what's the right thing for today? What's the right thing for 6 months from now?